At some point, in the 20th century, economics stopped feeling like a story about people and started reading like mathematics. Earlier thinkers wrote about merchants and farmers, ambition and envy, scarcity and power. Adam Smith explored incentives and moral responsibility. Thorstein Veblen ridiculed social pretensions and status games. John Maynard Keynes dwelled on uncertainty, panic, and the restless animal spirits of markets. Economics was messy, human, full of argument. It reflected life itself. Then it shifted. Suddenly, economics spoke in symbols. Charts replaced anecdotes. Assumptions hardened into rigid rules, and a field once grounded in moral philosophy began presenting itself as objective, neutral, and scientific. Not because society demanded it, but because one man found a way to give economics the credibility it had always sought. Welcome to the Wealth Casebook, where money, power, and history intersect. And nothing is ever as simple as it seems. To understand why Paul Samuelson mattered, you first have to grasp the world he entered. The early 20th century proved unforgiving for economists. Classical theory had promised orderly markets, rational choices, and stability over time. Then came the Great Depression. Production collapsed. Jobs beneath, banks faltered, and the prevailing economic theories offered no immediate solutions. Into this void stepped Keynes, challenging conventions. He suggested that markets could remain irrational longer than individuals could endure financially, and that governments occasionally needed bold intervention to stabilize demand. His concepts worked politically and practically, but they remained human, intuitive, and discomforting to those who wanted economics to resemble a precise science rather than a philosophical pursuit. After World War II, the world demanded something different. Governments had grown larger. Institutions had strengthened. Policy decisions required justification. Economics needed to sound authoritative enough to guide central banks, ministries, and global organizations. It was no longer a forum for debate. It had become an engineering challenge. That's when Paul Samuelson appeared. Samuelson was not a revolutionary in the mold of Marx or Keynes. He did not seek to dismantle capitalism or redesign society. Instead, he pursued something subtler and, over time, far more influential: systematization. A young prodigy fascinated with mathematics and physics, Samuelson recognized that economics suffered from a credibility gap. It discussed endlessly, yet proved too little. If physics could describe planetary motion with equations, why couldn't economics similarly describe market dynamics? In 1947, Samuelson released Foundations of Economic Analysis. Even the title declared ambition. This was not a policy manifesto. It was a formal attempt to construct a unified framework capable of explaining consumer behavior, firm activity, and market results using consistent logic. The central premise was elegant in its simplicity. People optimize. Consumers seek maximum satisfaction. Firms pursue maximum profit. Markets coordinate these decisions. Under certain conditions, systems tend toward equilibrium. These statements were not moral judgments. They were modeling assumption stools that allowed economic activity to be represented mathematically. This is where Samuelson is often misunderstood. He did not claim humans were perfectly rational. Rather, he argued that models functioned more predictably when such assumptions were made. Accepting this principle, economics became orderly, elegant, and formidable. Borrowing mathematics from physics, economists also adopted its aura of certainty. Suddenly, economics could deliver clear predictions. Prices responded to incentives. Supply matched demand. Shocks appeared as temporary deviations from a stable baseline. The economy, like a machine, could be analyzed, adjusted, and guided. One of Samuelson's major achievements was the neoclassical synthesis. This effort sought to reconcile Keynesian insights with classical economics rather than supplant them. In essence, markets generally allocate resources efficiently, yet occasionally malfunctioned. When they do, governments can step in to stabilize demand. Once equilibrium is restored, markets resume control. It was a compromise that satisfied most observers. Free markets remained intact, and government intervention became both legitimate and circumscribed. Economics now possessed a unified narrative, ready to be taught, published, and defended. Samuelson's textbook, Economics, an introductory analysis, became the most influential economics book ever written. For decades, it shaped generations of students who would go on to lead central banks, financial institutions, universities, and governments. It didn't merely explain economics, it defined it. At this point, the transformation became permanent. When a framework becomes curriculum, it stops being questioned. Models become defaults. Assumptions fade from view. Alternative perspectives begin to appear unprofessional rather than merely different. Economics gained rigor, legitimacy, and immense influence over policy. Yet something quietly shifted. Human behavior became simplified. Power relations receded. Psychology was considered noise. Crises were treated as anomalies rather than fundamental features. Economics began to speak about people rather than to them. Samuelson did not act with ill intent. He genuinely sought to improve human welfare, but his success produced a discipline increasingly reliant on models over lived experience. When economics learned to speak with authority, it also learned to speak at a distance, and that distance still shapes how modern financial systems function, how policy decisions are justified, and why so many feel economics happens to them rather than with them. Once Samuelson's framework took root, economics didn't just change markets, it altered the way power legitimized itself. Models became more than tools. They became shields. Central banks, ministries of finance, and international organizations adopted Samuelson's language because it offered clarity. If economic behavior could be reduced to optimization and equilibrium, policy could be framed as technical necessity rather than political choice. Decisions were no longer moral or ideological, they were dictated by the model. The Samuelsonian worldview assumed stability as the norm. Shocks were considered external. Crises were exceptions. Markets, left largely to their own devices, would naturally tend toward balance. When they did not, the problem was framed as insufficient data or temporary distortion. The solution was more precise calibration, not a fundamental rethinking of the system. This framework worked exceptionally well during calm periods. Inflation could be monitored, growth could be forecast, trade-offs could be optimized. Economics became indispensable for governments attempting to steer increasingly complex societies. Yet the same approach faltered when confronted with events that refused to follow neat rules. Bubbles, panics, crashes, and systemic collapses were too erratic, too non-linear, too human. Modern economics often treated these phenomena as deviations, errors, to be corrected rather than intrinsic characteristics of financial systems. The consequences were tangible. During periods of market overheating, risk was underestimated. Accumulating leverage often remained hidden in aggregate statistics. Confidence could collapse faster than equations could adapt. When crises struck, institutions had to respond to realities their models had marginalized. The global financial crisis of 2008 laid this tension bare. Sophisticated risk models performed flawlessly until they didn't. Assumptions about diversification, rational behavior, and liquidity failed simultaneously. The problem was not it was overconfidence in a narrow lens. When the system failed, the response did not question its foundations. It patched the structure. Liquidity was injected. Interest rates were lowered. Balance sheets expanded. Extraordinary interventions were labeled temporary even as they became effectively permanent. The same models that failed to anticipate the crisis were relied upon to manage its aftermath. Nothing says stability like leaning on emergency measures for over a decade. Here lies the paradox of Samuelson's legacy. On one hand, modern economics enabled unprecedented coordination. Without formalized models, crisis response might have descended into chaos. Policy needed structure, markets required reassurance. Technical precision helped avert total collapse. On the other hand, the distance between policymakers and the public widened. When policies were presented as mathematical necessities, ordinary people experienced inflation, asset bubbles, and inequality not as unfortunate byproducts, but as evidence that the system served someone else. Economics spoke confidently. People felt excluded. Ironically, Samuelson himself grasped uncertainty better than many of his intellectual heirs. He recognized that models were simplifications and warned against literal interpretation. But once frameworks became institutionalized, caution was filtered out. Precision endured. Humility faded. Compare this to Keynes, who argued that economists should openly admit what they did not know, or Veblen, who highlighted the ways power and status distort markets beyond what models can capture, or Adam Smith, who never separated economics from moral consequence. Samuelson did not erase these thinkers, but he shifted the center of gravity. Economics transformed into a discipline executed by experts for institutions, using tools ordinary citizens were not expected to question. Language became cleaner. Models became sharper. The messy reality of human economic life was relegated to the margins. Modern debates on inflation, debt, and financial stability often feel abstract because people are right to sense unease. The system optimized precision at the expense of empathy. Yet abandoning modern economics entirely would be a mistake. The answer is not to reject models, it is to recognize what they are. Maps, not territories. Samuelson furnished economics with a map detailed enough to guide policy across enormous systems, but no map captures every street, obstacle, or human reaction. When institutions forget this, they stop navigating and start dictating. The deeper lesson of Samuelson's legacy is not that economics became overly mathematical. It is that it grew overconfident in its abstractions. Financial systems fail not because people ignore models, but because they believe models can eliminate uncertainty. History does not repeat due to flawed theory. It repeats because humans overestimate the extent to which they have tamed complexity. Understanding Samuelson clarifies why modern economics appears powerful, distant, and simultaneously fragile. It explains why policy often sounds certain right, up until it is not. It illustrates why safeguarding financial freedom today requires more than blind faith in expert consensus. It demands an understanding of the assumptions beneath it. It shows why policy can sound decisive right up until it falters. And it shows why securing your financial independence today demands more than blind faith in expert authority. It requires understanding the principles and assumptions that underlie every model. When economics forgot it was about people, people began to doubt it. That divide has not vanished. It has widened. The only way to navigate it is not by rejecting expertise, but by refusing to mistake models for reality, certainty for truth, or technical precision for wisdom. If this gave you a fresh perspective, subscribe. History holds the answers. I'll guide you there.